Hello, everybody. Happy Friday. We have a wonderful guest with us today, Sonia Misak, who made a brilliant career in corporate insight and as an individual practitioner as well, helping companies innovate in different industries from technology to beauty to packaged goods by finding that human nugget of what our consumers want, so the innovators can come up with amazing products. So welcome, Sonia. And our question to you is, what's on your mind?
Oh, so many things on my mind, and so many things on my mind about this subject. One of the things when we talk about AI and when we talk about insight is, it's really reshaping how we understand people. And it's not only reshaping how we understand people, but also reshaping people's behavior. So we have this really interesting sort of two tensions coming together that what it means to be in this sort of business at this moment, but also what does it mean to be a consumer at this moment? And what does it mean
wait,
to
Sonia, I have a question on that.
Okay.
When you say that AI is shaping how we are understanding people, talk to us about from to, like what you typically do and how you do it differently and where it takes you.
Well, I think the landscape is really developing. So just now I actually have more questions than I have answers. And, if you have a look on, even scrolling on, social media or on LinkedIn or whatever, it's a little bit like doomsday for marketing and for insight. And it reminds me a lot of like the 2000s, which I'm old enough I will fess up that I'm old enough to remember, where, this is the end of banking, this is the end of travel agencies, this is the end of bricks and mortar, retail. And in fact, where we find ourselves 20 years later is there's amazing omni-channel strategies and there's amazing, so I think at this point in time, we're still at the beginning of this is the end of. And it actually, the question for me today also is how can we be additive in a conversation about this and not, just all the hyperbole that's around AI and it's changing everything, but at the same time, it is reshaping. So
I was going to say there was a quote, I think, from that I think somebody mentioned at a conference I was at, I think it was from Bill Gates, is that we are vastly overestimating what AI can do today and vastly underestimating what it will be able to do in 10 years. And I think that makes sense. And I think it's like the hype ends up being wrong about what it's going to do, right?
Yeah.
I think that's,
Yeah, I think that's exactly what's happening. And I mean, if we have a look at what's actually happening now, I mean, I think I would separate out perhaps insight and research from sort of strategic and brand work. But, there's a lot of new predictive analysis and a lot of behavioral modeling at scale happening using AI. Really interesting. I mean, some of the big brands that are using it, like Netflix, measuring engagement, looking at predictive content and sort of thumbnail testing and seeing what's engaged more. And we did some UX work last year, which was pretty similar, where on a very much smaller scale, which is a different question about running a small business and using these tools, which maybe we'll come back to. But where in experiments we could swap out. In UX experiments, we had a mock-up website and we could swap out photos of the products that we were dealing with. And it's very interesting when you do that. These are just, the sort of thumbnails and you can see where engagement is. And because you can also measure the time spent and, eye tracking, whatever the different experiments we did. But what the predictive analysis from AI does is it tells you what's happening and what is more engaging, but it doesn't necessarily tell you why. And it doesn't necessarily create the boundaries around it. We knew from this particular study, which was on appliances, that when you show an appliance that's filled with food, for example, if it's a fridge or with an oven with actual food, there's some very interesting sort of behavioral science concepts that make people more engaged here. We know that people are more engaged with that than just showing an empty fridge, and we know why. But we can also, because we know why, see where the edges of that are. And this is something, to your point, Eric, that AI can't do that yet. It can tell you what is most engaging, but it actually
Right.
can't tell you the why behind the what. And, I think that's a really sort of interesting thing that's happening at the moment as it's developing.
So wait, before we move on, I want to go back to that statement yet again and said, and it also kind of reshaping us as humans.
Yes.
So let's talk about that, because that is
Ooh.
very interesting and very meaty, kind of.
Yeah, very. I think there are different things that I think the first thing that it's changing is changing expectations from consumers, instant, personalized, whatever it is. I think there's a lot of, people are using ChatGPT or whichever search engine you choose instead of a search engine. I'm even calling it a search engine now, because effectively that's already a change. And what that can do is vastly different. And, that's why Gemini is an add-on, if you like, to the Google search engine. So I think in that way, there's a new expectation from consumers just about the speed of things and what they can find out and what they can do. And it's much more personalized and much more predictive. This idea that something can anticipate you, I think, is really interesting. There's AI as a co-creator in the fashion space. There's some really interesting things happening here, where Stitch Fix is one brand that's doing it well. I saw another app. They take a photograph and they analyze your body type, and then they change your outfits for you, whatever it is. All of these services, but that's changing how people viewing fashion, how they're viewing shopping, how they're making decisions. And I feel like consumers are, mainstream consumers are beginning to embrace this, and it will have a shift. And another aspect of this, which I think is really interesting, is if I look at TikTok and I look at how cultural trends spread, the algorithm is the insight generator. I mean, the algorithm itself is creating trends. And so it's no longer a tool that's separate, and it's no longer just a social media. It's creating things that spread across the world, actually, and amongst consumers that never had anymore. And again, that had never happened before. And again, that changes consumers' behavior.
So
that's fascinating, Sonia. Let me ask you on this subject. Do you think, well, let me rephrase it. Who do you think are the early adopters of these AI expectations? Is that the TikTok kids? Is that the techies? Is that the professionals? Who do you think is at the forefront?
The forefront. Well, I think it's a really interesting question, because I think a lot of people have adopted it without realizing, because we don't understand necessarily the technology that we're using and the apps that we're using or the decisions that we're making. And I think a lot of people have adopted it without realizing that this is AI generated. And, even you could ask a consumer if they used AI, and I've done this recently, and they're like, oh no. And then, you find out, you watch them, we do a lot of watching screens as people, it's part of UX research. And as people surf and look at, browse. And what's really interesting is they are using chatbots, or they are using, instead of calling customer care, they're typing into somebody, but they're not seeing that necessarily, that this is AI. So I think there are different things, which is a really interesting question. There are people who are using it without realizing it because they don't know what technology they're using. But there's also then people who are adopting, the young generation are really, the generation, the second generation of digital natives have got a very different expectations than previous generations of what's possible.
Sonia, I wanted to, so we often, so Jeff and I have a marketing company that we're trying to get off the ground. And a lot of the conversations that we've had with people, particularly other marketing agencies, where we're trying to say, hey, we can help you move into this AI space. And they'll be like, it will never be able to do it as well as we can do it. It's never going to be as good, et cetera. But on the flip side of that, I saw something recently on social media, probably on LinkedIn, where somebody was saying, unfortunately, even if you can do it better, people actually prefer the AI images over the
real ones
in a lot of cases. And so I guess my question is, how are you thinking about that problem of one, people saying, oh, it's to me, it's a protective thing, right?
Yeah.
Well, they can't do it as well as I can. And it's like, well, first of all, maybe that's not true. Second of all, maybe what you think your level of perfection may not actually be the right target.
Be the right thing.
I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think it's such an interesting question because, and there are different answers to it, I guess. The first thought I have around that is, yes, I do think that's a protective and a defense mechanism. I've heard it called fake research, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that looking at the different ways that companies are already starting to use it doesn't necessarily mean that there's not space for two different things. I mean, if you're not using it, the thing is if we were running through, some of the things, the predictive and analytics behavior, the AI generated personas that I keep seeing, instead of real people, we do a qualitative project where we talk to people and bring to life them in personas or segmentations, and AI can now do this. Synthetic respondents, virtual ethnographies, all of these things are happening already. So to say, right. I guess my attitude towards it is to try it and see, because it's only until you've experienced it that you can say, well, actually, this is the point of difference that I make as a researcher, or as, I guess my bottom line about it is there is still room for intuition, and sometimes embracing some of these things. The generative AI is really interesting to use with consumers if they're talking about packaging design, or if they're talking, and it doesn't necessarily replace a designer, but it's a start in a way that you could never have before. And I think this is really interesting. Like, well, how can I use it, and how can I understand? So when I'm talking to a client, to show that I'm willing to use it and I'm embracing a technology, but also to point out the sort of difference that people make, that talking to actual real people make. And I think it really depends on the sort of usage that you've got from it. For example, there's all sorts of examples of L'Oreal, or it used to be some of the Japanese brands would be using AI to do all sorts of personalized products, or do all sorts of analysis of skin, et cetera, et cetera. And, it's like, yes, I can also talk to a consumer, but what I'm going to find out are different things than the AI finds out. And there's almost room for both things. And it seems that it's really, really good at speed, which is amazing. There's so much time wasted in business. This is fantastic. It seems that it's really good at sort of trends and sort of social listening. It's really efficient. I think, when I look at some brands, they're using video analytics tools for facial recognition in a way that a researcher couldn't necessarily, micro-expression research stuff. The speed of that and the speed of being able to code it is incredible. But there's a lot of things that I would call risks or tensions still with this. And that's where maybe the naysayers are right. But I guess I would frame it slightly differently. Let's try this and see what it's good at. And it makes my job different than it was before, maybe as a researcher, as a qualitative researcher in particular, but also it's not a bad thing necessarily.
Yeah, and I actually would add to that, because I think one of the things that I see happening is this concept of, I'm going to try it once. If it doesn't do it perfectly the first time, I'm going to, again, this is part of that whole protective mechanisms, I'm just going to declare that it can't do it. And so it's not just embrace it in terms of like try it. It's actually, you got to try it and learn how to use it. It's a tool like anything. It's like I pick up the violin, and a violin I've never played before, and it doesn't sound good, and I'm like, see, that's a terrible instrument. I'd much rather play the piano because I can just plunk the key, right? This is what I think. There's this sort of, and this may be more of a last year thing than a this year thing. I think people are coming more around. I think more people are coming around to the AI side, but I think it's complex, a relationship that people have.
And I also AI is evolving so fast, right? What used to be a really terrible violin when you tried. By now, it has become pretty good violin because
Yeah.
AI is evolving at the speed of light, just about, right? And it's going to be Stradivari soon, right? So
Yeah.
Yeah,
I do.
as an
Yeah.
example of that, Elena, I was generating an image on ChatGPT, and it was of kids playing soccer on a soccer field, and every single kid had the right number of fingers.
hey,
Which is a huge win.
that's a good win.
Yeah, it is really interesting though, because I do think there are some things, particularly, in research that it can't do yet, but I'm rooting for it to learn that. One of the things, particularly I work in one of the things very important in my own research is looking at context, looking at subconscious influences on decision making. As you know, we're not rational, and priming is a particular sort of personal interest of mine. Like what are the subconscious sensory primes that people have before they make a decision that could influence that decision? And the data that any of the research engines use just now, any of these sorts of AI powered, doesn't include contextual data, and it doesn't include the sort of, it can't include the subconscious primes yet. So it is incomplete, and then you do lose a huge amount of nuance in it. So I think there are some things that I might say, well, not yet, it's not happening yet, but it can do this really, really well. So why wouldn't we use it to do this? And just back on this thing about the sort of naysaying, the one thing that I'm struggling with as somebody starting a small business is that clients don't want to pay. And they particularly if they have internal they've set up, some of my former clients have set up really quite sophisticated internal AI engines, and I don't know what you call them even. I don't even have the language for it. But then they don't want to pay for either fresh research, and the issue with that is a lot of it is retrospective. It doesn't include sort of complex contextual behavior, and it doesn't include anything, but then they don't want to pay for research. And at the moment, I'm trying to be sort of glass very full at this moment, half full at this moment, saying, well, actually, there will be a point in a few months' time or in a year's time when the value of some of the almost old-fashioned skills, I'm an ethnographer by training, and this sort of more longitudinal doing in situ research may come back actually as a complement. So in my day-to-day life, they may not want to pay, and I will use AI to then cut my prices because it cut the cost of doing a piece of research, because it's my time and it is quicker. But there may well be a full circle moment where the skills, I'm hoping still, will come back, because actually at the end of the day, the sort of actually observing consumers and understanding the things that go into their decision making is still valuable, not just what decisions.
I agree with you. I mean, we're seeing the same thing. Like, you talk to people and they're like, well, we can just do that ourselves. Yeah. I'm like, first of all, you probably can't. And second of all, if you can, why aren't you? That's another thing. And the third thing is, like, I absolutely agree with what you just said, Sonia, with the idea that and I also kind of share your optimism that it's only months away from a person whose livelihood relies on this, that it's only months away, maybe it's a year, but that people will start to understand that in order to do it, there was this sort of free-for-all, going back to the swarming kids on the soccer field, there's sort of this free-for-all, but to actually do it in an organized, smart way, bringing multiple tools to bear, conceptualizing everything that it can do for you, is going to start to once again take expertise. And I don't know, I hear people obviously worry about their jobs and whatever from AI, and I'm just like, the jobs will be different, but as long as you're open to and capable of learning those new jobs, there's going to be, I actually see, for example, in advertising and marketing, I actually think there's going to be a lot more work, because more companies can now do what only a small number of companies could do, back, just 3 years ago.
Yeah.
Well, I also think that we have to draw a difference between AI as an experimentation personal or in a workspace, and enterprise level AI. So what you're describing is truly enterprise AI. And when that comes, the nature of work is going to be different. And our relationships with AI and our roles on the team, human team members versus AI team members, and all of that is going to be very, very different and exciting. And in that spirit, I actually have to play Jeff today and bring our AI team member here.
Okay, yay.
Questions for
Nice
Sonia.
transition, Elena.
Exactly. I'm being a smooth Jeff today. So here we go. So Sonia, we get two types, a thought-provoking or obscure question generated by ChatGPT just for you. What would you like?
Obscure, obviously.
Obscure. Let's just see. I don't know to what degree it is obscure, but this is interesting. What is the strangest consumer behavior you have seen that actually led to a great product idea?
That's more thought-provoking, I think, than absurd. So yeah.
Probably. I don't know how it delineates, but
I think Jeff's usually is like if it's a dad joke, it's usually, like that's more absurd.
Exactly.
I appreciate you giving me a moment to think about this, because I'm just trying to think of sort of, I don't know. I don't
just go for any weird behavior. I'm sure you have seen them in me.
Oh, I've seen them. Yeah, but the thing is,
my daughters right here, I'll give you a weird behavior. They look at the mirror, rub the makeup off their face, and rub it on the wall next to the mirror. It's a weird consumer behavior for you right then and there.
I don't even understand that. I mean,
it would take an AI and a human being to understand. Why would you ever do that?
Yeah,
but that's beside the point.
Yeah, I feel like consumers never ever behave in a rational way, or there's no normal for me anymore, which might be quite a switch. Like it would take really a lot to surprise me, I think. And I think one of the things I'm really interested in is language, what people call things. Particularly, I know last week your guest was talking about menopause and fitness, and I feel like one of these things for me is like when women are talking about their bodies, some of the words they use, that would be like a weird behavior, but then it's not really weird. It's like, well, actually, this is really interesting culturally. And I tend not to have like a normal baseline anymore, because that I feel like consumers do, irrational things all the time. And
I can relate to that. And on the thought-provoking, this is an interesting one. I liked it. It asked, can empathy be scaled?
Hang on, you have to say it again. I froze again. Sorry. What did you say?
It said, can empathy be scaled?
This is like an existential question.
I
know, right? ChatGPT is like amazing today.
Can empathy be scaled? Do you know, this is a slightly different answer, but there's a really interesting professor in the University of Linz. She's called Martina Maurer, and she works on anthropomorphism and AI, and how we're becoming very familiar. And there was an article a few weeks ago about everybody saying thank you and please to ChatGPT. You had this huge energy cost because you're adding in words and you're creating more energy loss with this. But in her work, I think it's really interesting because we are anthropomorphizing. We are seeing the chatbot as having, it started, and then it starts to use emojis back to you, and then you're having, there's been a few cases of, all these stories, sensational stories about having your virtual girlfriend in the movies and whatever. But then throwing back the question to you is, if it learns so fast and we are anthropomorphizing it and showing it empathy and showing it humor and showing it some of these things, can it learn that emotion back? So I guess that's a roundabout way of saying, yes, it could be scaled potentially, I guess.
Well, listen, we're already trying with jokes, right? At least like on my team, we do various different, hey, can AI come up with some jokes? And over time, I am seeing that it's coming up with better and better jokes. So yes, it's trainable, right? And then you're saying, okay, if it's trainable in humor, why couldn't it be trainable in empathy?
Yeah.
So
it's part, I guess another question is, part of the reason it is having trouble exhibiting that empathy because we're not giving it all the information it needs. In other words, it doesn't, at least the way I generally use ChatGPT, it doesn't see me. It doesn't see my body language. It's not hearing the tone of my voice. I'm just typing into it. If you gave it all that, it might actually be.
It might learn it over time.
React to it.
Although what's really interesting with the reliance on going back to qualitative research and using AI to analyze your transcripts is it doesn't seem to learn that yet. And partly because it's using the transcripts, not the video. And when you use these sort of video avatar type interviewers, they don't understand that a pause could mean more than one thing as the consumer is thinking about something. And they don't yet understand, obviously they don't see the body language. And particularly when you're talking about sensitive subjects, which would be the point that exhibiting empathy is an interesting idea, then, it doesn't do that. And in fact, I think sometimes the AI can cause a bias because of its lack of empathy, because it goes on in a research context. It will continue, it could reinforce a line of consumer answering, reinforce a line of consumer thought because of the way that it is, sort of quite flat coming back. And you might find that consumers overstate something. And in fact, again, it's very logical reasoning, both from a consumer perspective. It's not capturing, you're not capturing anything subconscious or intuitive here. But also the chat, avatar or whatever itself is not learning empathy because it doesn't read it like that.
And also because we're not teaching it like that to our conversation, right? It's not that Eric said, hello, I had an unfortunate morning because something didn't work out. Now I have a tear in my eye. This means I'm upset, right? So this kind of is a completely different training type rather than, okay, give me my next pitch. My last one didn't work out, right? It's
no, really interesting.
I think it's when it's really past that sort of next level of Turing test is going to be when it can figure out that you're being sarcastic or ironic, and then you're like, okay, now it's really getting
the singularity is here, right? It could be.
I actually think there's some pretty my gut feeling is that this is actually fairly trainable. We're just not supplying most of the learning it's doing. I also think there's some really interesting, I don't know how much you've played around with the image generation of ChatGPT, which I think is fantastic. I use it all the time for LinkedIn posts and so forth.
I use it to make my dog a human or to make my children animals.
It's interesting to your point about AI affects how people act, because when I saw, there was that trend a couple of weeks ago where everyone was making themselves into an action figure in a plastic, maybe this is 2 months ago, whatever. That's when I actually started using ChatGPT's image generation for other marketing, because for me, the exciting part about that was I can describe something and it can create a really interesting image using it. What unfortunately I saw a lot of people doing is just saying, I can join the trend. And that is not as interesting as the fact that it can work with it. And the reason I bring this up is because of the way that this appears, at least in my understanding of how it works, is that it uses ChatGPT does not have a native model that does in a single step. You put in an image and you say, turn this into whatever, and then it turns it into another image. It actually has to comprehend. That's the first run is comprehension of what the image you put in is. And then it creates a text, based on your prompt, it creates text of what it's going to create. And then it does an language to image. And it's that really interesting combination of these multiple models together. And that's where I think maybe the sort of empathetic kind of piece might come in, where you actually apply it in some kind of, serial way. I think it's also going to be part of the the data that's fed in, but you may actually have, sort of, just like our brains work, right? We have different parts of our brain that are dealing with different pieces of the social equation.
Yeah, with different things. Yeah, it's super, super interesting. It's really interesting questions.
So let's looping this back too. So we've gone a little bit afield. ChatGPT really pushed the envelope with our thought provoking this time around. But so how apply this back to your work and what you do in research, and how do you think that the sort of next phases of AI, as Elena said before, it's changing every day. Where do you think the next sort of frontier of what you're going to be working with, and when is it going to be?
Yeah, I think that's really tricky. It's hard to say, because also when I look at corporations that are my clients, there is such big difference in adoption and in sort of also an investment in this. So the companies that have invested already, are at a completely different stage. I think I saw some top 10 list, and it was fascinating who's invested, who's not, and it's kind of, it's one of those things that's also really makes it very hard to predict, because does it mean that those companies are going to not do research, or are they actually, the other thing is data isn't the same as insight, and it's all very well, getting insights from your sort of search engines and your sort of but that, what to do with it, that also doesn't make insight actionable. There's several steps, as we discussed earlier. So it's really hard to predict the future of this, because I think it may well be that the storytelling around the insight doesn't go away. That's still very important, and how to make this actionable doesn't go away either. And I think that those things the AI can't do. It can solve your need for presentation, maybe if you're in a corporation, or if I'm presenting, and it can give you a structure for something, but it can't necessarily give you an aha moment. And I think I do keep thinking about it in terms of collaboration. It's like this sort of co-collaboration, both the way it's happening with consumers now. Some of the more successful sort of AI-driven services or apps are collaborating, where consumers have an input, like the fashion ones, as well as the technology. And I think that's really interesting. And I also think what's really interesting is the whole idea of privacy and security. And there is an assumption, where is that going to go? And culturally, I think in the US there's a lot more leeway with, people they're not as concerned as, say, in Europe with certain things about privacy and security. But it's a really interesting question. Like if the adoption continues at this rate, like, what do they know, and do you care, and as a consumer, and what does this mean?
Actually, I think the other piece of that question is, does it matter whether you care about it or not? Like, somebody was saying to me, they didn't like using ChatGPT because maybe they're getting their information is being put in, and I was like, do you have a phone? Does it have a microphone?
Yeah.
Well, but then there is also a question of ethics, right?
Yeah.
Because when it comes to humans as a society, we have certain ethical standards, right? Are we training AI on ethical standards? And if yes, which ones? And how does that, societally gets processed? So I think that is something that we're not grasping as of yet. I don't think enough, at least, and it's upon us. It will be very short.
Yeah. And, particularly again with this sort of having your AI as your friend, and I can't even remember which one it is that has the ad where it's your co-pilot in life or whatever. It's like, what does that mean for the ethics? Whereas it's a very, very thin line between it's giving you recommendations on how to vote, or it's giving you recommendations on what book to read, or whatever else it's bringing up, which is kind of interesting.
And by the way, people trust their parents, their bartender or whatever to tell them who to vote. Like, why would they? This thing knows everything, right? And I also think it's really interesting to consider the fact that the foundation of these foundation models that we're dealing with are going to have been based on a particular snapshot in time a particular level of thinking that we have reached. And the question is, how hard is it going to be in 10 years to push the status quo of these foundation models towards something else? Because now it's established and on a feedback loop as well.
That's all right. We'll unleash a few TikTokers and they'll take care of it.
That's right.
They'll propel the innovation right into all the existing models. Come on. But
yeah. So we are.
Where was matcha 2 years ago? No.
we're well into the 30-minute past the 30-minute mark, and so before we go, we always want to go around and have everybody say one thing that they want to leave our audience with. I always make the guest go first because I mean that way. Sonia, what's one thing that you would like to leave the audience with?
I guess my take on it just now is that AI is really amplifying what we can do as insights professionals. But the role of strategist or like human insight expert is more important than ever, actually. Even just this moment of talking about ethics, talking about how people behave, talking about the decisions they make. And, you know, our job is not necessarily to compete with the machine. It's to guide it, in a sense, to use it to its best. So I guess it's sort of a little bit provocative in a sense, but it's also like, you know, what does it mean to really know a consumer today, and what do you need? How can you get to know your consumer today?
Absolutely.
So I'm going next, and I'm going to play Jeff, who usually asks our guests where we can find them. So Sonia, where can we find you?
I'm rather embarrassed, but probably best is LinkedIn.
No, so LinkedIn is a
wonderful.
wonderful.
I'm on LinkedIn 24/7. It's totally fun.
Exactly. LinkedIn is good. So we will tell our viewers to look for you on LinkedIn. And meanwhile, I am actually going to somewhat echo what you have said, because to me, the most interesting aspect of what we just talked about is that even in the ultimately one of the most human-focused professions, which is yours, right? Which is behavioral insight in commercial sense, right? But nonetheless, you study brains and decision science and emotions. Even that is being impacted by AI. And I'm fascinated how you are adjusting to use the machine where your work stream can be improved and concentrate and focus the human skills where they're needed. So I think it's a fascinating example of adoption. And I'm curious to see how it unfolds as AI becomes the, better and better tool.
Absolutely. There's something you brought up at the end that's going to be my one thing, is this unevenness of companies, of people, etc. And you know what? I think there's always opportunity for people who worry about their jobs. There's always opportunity in that unevenness, right? There are people, like you said, Sonia, there's people who come to you and they have all these sophisticated things or whatever, but there's also lots of people who haven't even thought to talk to you yet, who just haven't even gotten there, haven't even started. I mean, let's be honest. There are still people who do their books with a written ledger and one of those adding machines. People are still doing that. So I'm not saying that's a lot of people. I'm saying that there's a lot of room for people to work with companies as they handle that unevenness. And that unevenness is not only, by the way, going to be, and I don't know if you also experience this as much as I do, is there's unevenness just in my understanding. I would say I'm ahead of the curve in some ways, and I'm way behind the curve in other ways in terms of some of the things that I've heard people are doing. So there's just a lot to, sort of catch up on and learn and keep experimenting with. Sonia, this has been a fantastic, I think we're going to hit 40 minutes in about 30 seconds. It's been a fantastic 40-minute conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Really thought-provoking conversation. Thank you so much.
No, thank you both so much. Pleasure.